Just a figure, partially visible facing the camera. The editor reported it. The following day, he was reassigned. The explanation was administrative, but among the crew, the message was clear. Some things were not meant to be questioned. As pressure increased, so did conflict. Disagreements over legacy, over final moments, over who would be remembered, not just by audiences, but by history, grew more intense. At one point, a confrontation reportedly broke out behind closed doors. Raised voices, accusations, silence afterward. From that day forward, security increased again. Certain people stopped appearing on set, and others began smiling more. When Avengers Endgame was finally released, the world saw a masterpiece, a carefully crafted farewell, an emotional conclusion that felt complete. But those who had been there saw something else. They saw compromises. They saw quiet victories. They saw losses that were never acknowledged. And years later, one former crew member summarized it best. Some films tell stories. Some films make money. Endgame was made to close doors. Perhaps that is why the ending feels so final. Not just because the story ended, but because something else did too. Something that was never meant to be seen and never meant to be spoken about. Avengers Endgame, 2019. The story no one ever spoke about. This story does not exist in any official Marvel record. It was never mentioned in interviews. It was never included in behind-the-scenes documentaries. And yet, some people who worked on Avengers Endgame still say that certain nights from that production follow them into their sleep. Because Endgame was not just a film, it was pressure, it was ambition, and for some, it was betrayal. In late 2018, inside a heavily secured studio complex in Atlanta, Marvel Studios was preparing the most important project in its history. The final chapter of a saga that had dominated global cinema for over a decade. Security was absolute. Scripts were fragmented. Scenes were filmed out of order. Actors were given incomplete information. No one was allowed to know more than necessary. Because one mistake, one leak, could destroy everything. But the greatest risk did not come from outside the studio. It came from within, from the people who knew exactly how much Endgame was worth. Not just financially, but personally. Because everyone understood one thing very clearly. Whoever stood strongest at the end of Endgame would shape the future of Marvel. Careers would rise, others would quietly disappear. And when stakes reach that level, loyalty becomes fragile. Early into production, something happened that the studio never officially acknowledged. A low-resolution clip surfaced briefly online before disappearing almost instantly. It was blurry, incomplete, and useless to the public, but internally, it caused panic. Because the image showed a detail that had never been revealed, a costume element that did not exist in any trailer, teaser, or promotional material. Marvel's internal investigation reached an uncomfortable conclusion. This was not a hack. This was not an external breach. The footage had come from inside the production pipeline. And that single fact changed the atmosphere on set overnight. From that moment on, everyone became a potential suspect. Crew members stopped speaking freely. Actors began questioning why certain scenes were rewritten. Some schedules changed without explanation, and slowly, quietly, mistrust took root. People began to notice something else. Different versions of the same scene were being filmed, not for creative reasons, but for control. Some scenes existed in 3 or 4 variations, all contradicting each other. Even the actors did not know which version would be used. Some pages of the script contained strange, almost meaningless descriptions, lines that made no sense unless you already knew the truth behind them. It was later understood that these were deliberate misdirections. If a script page ever leaked, it would reveal nothing of value. Marvel had turned its own screenplay into a puzzle. But this approach had consequences. When people no longer understood the story they were telling, tension grew. And tension feeds ego. As filming continued, rumors spread that certain characters were being repositioned, that screen time was being redistributed, that key moments were quietly reassigned. One morning, an updated shooting schedule circulated. Most people glanced at it casually, but some noticed something disturbing. A major scene remained, but a name had vanished. No explanation, no announcement, just absence. That was the moment many realized that Endgame was no longer just a film production. It was a battlefield. Because in Hollywood, removal is rarely accidental. There was a room on set that few people talked about openly. Unofficially, crew members referred to it as the Purple Room. Entry required clearance. Phones were prohibited. Names were checked twice. Scenes filmed there were handled differently, rendered separately, stored separately, and no one was allowed to discuss what they had seen inside. One lighting technician would later say that entering that room felt less like walking onto a set and more like stepping into a courtroom. According to Quiet Whispers, an alternative ending was filmed there, an ending that reframed everything, an ending that stripped certain characters of their heroic image, an ending that was never meant to be released. The footage was completed, logged, archived, and then erased. Officially, it never existed. During post-production, another incident occurred. Late at night, while rendering a final battle sequence, a secondary editor noticed something odd on the timeline. A single frame appeared where no frame should exist. Barely a fraction of a second. When isolated and enlarged, it showed something that did not belong. Not a character, not an extra, not an effect.